The rig sites never made sense to me as a child. That was the first thing I said when Director Aldenmer gave me the posting. I was 23 years old, freshly certified in Basin Infrastructure Watch, and he slid the assignment across the table with the weary look of a man who had heard every objection already. Southern Megaplex, Tesavar Basin Collective, Watch Coordinator, Infrastructure Division. The job paid well, the apartment allotment was generous, and the Tesavar sites were considered the most historically significant monitoring posts on the planet. I didn't want historically significant. I wanted the orbital rail stations, the forward construction rings, the glamorous assignments where watch coordinators wore shielded jackets and spoke to warship captains by name. He told me to go home, pack my things, and report to Basin Station 12 within the week. I went. That was 41 years ago. I am 64 now, and I have spent more than 4 decades learning, in slow increments, what the Tesavar sites actually are, what they were, what they mean. I have logged their resonance signatures every Tuesday morning for 4 decades. I have read every volume the Planetary Archive has published on their origin and structure. I have attended 3 International Origin Studies conferences as a representing observer, listened to scholars argue the same questions I had been carrying since my 20s, and come home each time with the slow accumulating certainty that the answer we were all circling was simpler and more vertiginous than any of us wanted to say aloud. 3 weeks ago, the Vethani Reclamation Syndicate arrived in our system with 38 ships and a set of extraction depot protocols that matched our own planetary defense encryption key by key, layer by layer, all the way down to the base architecture. And I finally understood everything. Let me start at the beginning, not my beginning, the actual beginning. 70,000 years ago, before the Tesavar Basin had a name, before the megaplex stretched from the old coastline to the inland plateau, before there was anything on this part of the continent that could be called a city, there were rigs. We know this now with certainty. We have known it, in increasing degrees of specificity, for roughly the past 11,000 years. But in the early era of discovery, when the first deep excavators cracked the Tesavar bedrock and brought up components made of materials that didn't exist in any natural geological deposit, the prevailing theory was that they were alien in origin, abandoned and inert, left here by someone who'd passed through the system and never came back. Abandoned was right. Inert was where everyone went wrong. The Tesavar rigs were not dead. They were dormant. There is a difference, and it turns out to be a difference that shaped the entire arc of human civilization. The early excavators brought up components that didn't match any known geology because they weren't geology. They were manufactured. Precision-fabricated conduit assemblies, resonance-tuned extraction chambers, latticed mineral concentration matrices, each piece made from alloys that took our metallurgists centuries to replicate, each piece fitting the others in a system so internally coherent that it couldn't be random. It was engineering. Alien engineering, obviously, but engineering in the deepest and most literal sense, structures designed with a purpose and built to last. The early scholars argued about that purpose for generations. The first consensus, around 11,000 years back, was that the rigs were mineral extraction devices. The second consensus, which came 3,000 years after the first and replaced it, was that they were specifically designed to concentrate rare earth mineral deposits in the upper crust layer over long time periods, drawing ore heavy substrates up through resonance-assisted diffusion from the deeper mantle, and binding them in recoverable concentrations near the surface. In other words, someone had salted the earth. Not to poison it, to harvest it. They planted extraction infrastructure 70,000 years ago, set it to run on a slow cycle that would spend tens of thousands of years doing the quiet mechanical work of concentrating value in the upper crust, and they intended to come back when the cycle completed and collect what they'd cultivated. We were not supposed to be here when they came back. I don't think they ever considered the possibility. The rigs ran for roughly the first 40,000 years of their intended cycle before humans found them. What the early excavators discovered when they cracked that first shaft in the Tesseract bedrock was active machinery. Machines that had been running, uninterrupted, in the sealed dark below the basin floor, doing their quiet work for 40 millennia before a human hand ever touched them. The resonance fields they generated were so low frequency that they passed through the bedrock and the soil above, and everything living on that soil without anyone ever noticing. The rigs were invisible by design. A system engineered to work without being seen, to cultivate without disturbing, to persist without acknowledgement across any timescale the deposit cycle required. When we found them, we didn't know what we had. That took time, a lot of time. The better part of 3,000 years, actually, between the first discovery and the moment our engineers began to understand the resonance diffusion principle well enough to attempt replication. Those were not wasted years. Every generation of researchers who worked on the Tesseract components left documentation that the next generation built on. The problem of what those rigs actually were, how they worked, what principle governed the mineral concentration process. That problem was passed down like a standing question, the kind of question that doesn't get answered in one lifetime but keeps getting sharper with each generation that holds it. The study of the Tesseract components fed every major industrial advancement humanity made across that 3,000-year span. The alloy sciences that gave us the first orbital rail construction frames came from materials scientists working on component analysis, who cracked the bonding lattice structure of the rig's conduit assemblies, and asked what would happen if you scaled the principle to structural applications. The resonance principles that underlaid the megastructure foundation systems came from physicists trying to understand why the extraction chambers maintained stable resonance frequencies across geologic timescales without degradation. The lattice matrix engineering that became the template for our defense grid power distribution network came from engineers who were trying to replicate the concentration matrices and produced, instead of a copy, a human adaptation that did something different and far more useful. None of those things were copied directly from the Tesseract rigs. They were developed independently by human engineers working on human problems. But the questions those engineers were asking, the specific problems they were working on, the materials they were trying to understand, the physical principles they were trying to master, those questions all originated in the long study of components pulled from the Tesseract bedrock. The rigs didn't give us our civilization. We built that ourselves. But the rigs gave us the questions, and the questions were everything. I learned all of this incrementally, the way you learn anything when you spend 4 decades at a monitoring post with a good library and very long stretches of quiet. The Basin Watch coordinator position is not glamorous, but it is educational. You sit at the intersection of the most significant archaeological site in the southern megaplex, a living industrial complex that still draws on the deep scan infrastructure originally built to monitor the Tesseract excavations, and an active node of the planetary defense grid whose encryption architecture. I know this now. I understand this now in a way I did not 2 months ago. Is descended in direct lineage from the resonance frequency protocols our engineers reverse engineered from the rig components 6,000 years ago. I spent my first decade understanding the monitoring arrays, the deep scan systems, the resonance logging protocols, the comparison baselines that let us distinguish a shift in ambient geological signature from a shift in the rig components themselves. The work is precise and repetitive and requires the kind of attention that most people find tedious. I found it grounding. There is something about regular, careful measurement of something ancient and stable that anchors you. You start to understand that your tenure in the post is a small increment in a very long, continuous record. You start to care about the record more than the tenure. My second decade I spent understanding the grid node. Basin Station 12 sits on a defense grid relay point, which means our monitoring infrastructure and the grid sensor arrays share physical space, shared power feeds, and in several places share active hardware. You cannot work at Basin Station 12 for long without starting to understand how the grid works, because the grid is half the building. I started asking questions the way I had been trained to ask them, carefully, methodically, building understanding from the ground up. And the grid engineers on the station were patient with me in the way that experts are patient with people who are genuinely curious, rather than merely performatively so. My third decade I spent understanding the relationship between the two, the monitoring arrays and the grid node, the rig sites and the defense infrastructure. This was the decade in which I began to see that the relationship was not incidental, that Basin Station 12 had not been built here by accident, and that the defense grid relay point had not been placed at this particular location in the southern megaplex because the geography was convenient. It had been placed here because this was where the most significant cluster of Tessavar rig sites was concentrated, and the planetary defense doctrine of that period included, as a specific provision, the mandate that known pre-human infrastructure sites of strategic significance should be integrated into the defense monitoring network. Strategic significance. The document that coined the phrase I found it in the Planetary Archive during my third decade, a Planetary Council policy brief from roughly 800 years ago, had a very specific meaning in mind, not tactical value. The rig sites had no tactical value. The alloy components had been extracted, the mineral deposits mined out, the physical infrastructure decommissioned. Tactically, the Tessavar sites were heritage geology. Nothing more. But strategically, the document was careful about the word. They were significant because they implied an owner, an entity or civilization that had made a substantial investment in Earth's subsurface geology, that had the capability to seed a planet with precision industrial infrastructure, and that might, at some point in the future, return to assess the status of that investment. The policy brief argued that this possibility had been in the academic literature for centuries and had never been formally incorporated into planetary defense doctrine, and that the omission was a failure of planning that the Council should correct. The Council agreed. The Heritage Protocol was written into the defense grid's alert taxonomy that same year. The base station at Tessavar, which had been a monitoring-only installation for several thousand years, was upgraded to include a full defense grid relay node. And somewhere in the deep architecture of the encryption system that runs the grid, layered into the base protocol stack 800 years ago by engineers who understood what they were encoding and why, they put a recognition key. A flag that would fire if anything broadcasting on the Tessavar rig's original resonance frequency ever spoke to the grid from outside the system. 800 years ago, my predecessor's 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 predecessor at Basin Station 12 was probably sitting at this same general monitoring post when that flag went into the system. I have thought about that chain of people, the long succession of watch coordinators who sat in this building, logged the resonance signatures on Tuesday mornings, and kept the records without ever seeing the Heritage Protocol flag fire. 40 generations of quiet watch, give or take. My fourth decade, I spent reading everything the Planetary Archive had published on the Tessavar rig origins, the pre-human construction timeline, and the theoretical question that had been in the academic literature for at least 3,000 years without a definitive answer. Why had whoever built these rigs never come back? I had my own private theory. I kept it to myself for most of that decade. It seemed too simple to be worth publishing, and I am a watch coordinator, not a scholar. But the theory was this: they hadn't come back yet. Not because they forgot, not because they were gone, because the cycle takes as long as it takes, and 60,000 years from now, or 40,000 or 10,000, they would run their accounting, compare the projected harvest timeline to the elapsed years, and decide it was time. They were in no hurry. You don't plan a 60 to 80,000 year investment with urgency. You plan it with patience, and you keep your records, and you come back when the numbers say to come back. I wrote that theory down in a personal notebook about 6 years ago, when I was approaching retirement age and thinking about whether there was anything I wanted to put on record before I finished. I didn't publish it. I didn't send it to the archive. I kept it in a notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk at Basin Station 12, which is where it still is, and which is, as of 3 weeks ago, the most accurate unpublished summary of the situation that existed anywhere in the scholarly record. They hadn't come back yet. Now they had. I want to be precise about the day the Vethani ships arrived, because precision matters when you spend your career at a monitoring post. It was a Tuesday, late morning local time. The sky above Tesavar Basin was the particular high-pressure clear that we get in the dry season, when the particulate scrubbers have been running all week, and the air carries that clean metallic quality that reminds you the megaplex's atmospheric management system hasn't had a fault in 80 years. I had a cup of tea. I was reviewing the previous week's deep scan logs from the rig monitoring arrays, the same as every Tuesday morning, because the rig sites still generate resonance signatures that require regular logging, even though the rigs themselves have been fully decommissioned. Their components either extracted for study or sealed in situ by heritage protocol. The rig sites always generate a faint signal, even inert. The alloy components sealed in the ground still resonate at their base frequencies, unchanged over millennia, the way a tuning fork keeps its pitch regardless of whether anyone is listening. I log those signals. I have logged them every Tuesday for 41 years. The readings are stable. They vary by less than a single measurement unit in either direction from the established baseline, and any variance beyond that threshold triggers an automatic flag to the duty officer. In 41 years, that flag has fired twice. Both times it was geological interference from a deep scan operation in an adjacent basin. Both times I filed a variance report, noted the geological source, and the readings returned to baseline within 48 hours. I have never filed a heritage protocol flag in 41 years at Basin Station 12. I want you to understand that because I think it explains something about the moment when the heritage flag fired on my board. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was a quality of arrested attention, a kind of stilled focus, the feeling of a thing you have been waiting for your entire professional life, arriving so quietly that you almost don't register it. The Planetary Defense Grid's outer system sensor web picked up the transit event at 10:04. That's when the alert came to my board, not as a combat notification. Those go to military watch first. As an infrastructure monitoring flag, a signal on the heritage protocol frequency, originating from the outer system, bearing Tesavar rig resonance base encoding. I looked at it for a long moment. I checked the reading against the baseline. The frequency match was exact, not close. Exact, down to the fractional resonance values that our monitoring systems had been recording for 11,000 years of continuous rig site documentation. Then I looked at the signal origin, outer system, multiple point sources vectoring inward. I want to say that again because I think it matters. The first Earth system to formally register the arrival of 38 alien ships entering our outer system was not a weapons platform or a warship or a military sensor array. It was the Infrastructure Monitoring Network at Basin Station 12, Southern Megaplex, Tesavar Basin Collective. Because the Vethani Reclamation Syndicate, on their approach vector, was broadcasting their arrival in the only language they expected the planet to speak, the extraction depot protocol codes keyed to the Tesavar rig architecture. Standard operating procedure for a resource collection operation arriving at a preceded depot world. You broadcast your depot codes on arrival so the automated systems below recognize you and begin preparing the harvest for collection. You do this the way you'd ping a storage facility on arrival to tell it you're coming to pick up your order. You transmit your manifest codes, and you expect the depot systems to wake up, verify your credentials, and begin the pre-collection sequence. The problem for them was that their depot codes were our base encryption layer, had been for 6,000 years. The resonance frequency protocol architecture our engineers reverse-engineered from the Tessivar components had become, over 6 generations of refinement and integration, the foundational encoding key for the entire planetary defense grid. It was buried so deep in the grid's architecture that most of the current engineering staff probably couldn't have told you where the encoding originated without looking it up. It was the ground level, the substrate, the thing below the things you consciously work on. When the Vethani Syndicate transmitted their depot arrival codes, they were transmitting in the frequency protocol of the Tessivar rigs. Our grid received that transmission and recognized it instantly, the way any encryption system recognizes a valid key signature at the root level. It recognized it, and it answered. Not in the way an automated depot system answers a collection signal, but in the way a security architecture answers an unregistered access attempt, with a cascade flag across every active system node. They were talking to our grid. Our grid was answering them in their own language, the way a lock answers a key, except the lock had been rebuilt over 6,000 years of human engineering into something their key had never been designed to open. The key fit the original architecture. It turned. And then every alarm in the planetary defense network registered the intrusion simultaneously, because their signal had touched the root layer of a system that now comprised orbital rings and weapons platforms and warships and strategic reserves that had no connection to the extraction depot they were looking for. I watched it happen on my board. The infrastructure monitoring flag was still active on my left display, 38 unregistered vessels broadcasting on a frequency our system recognized as an indigenous root protocol. When my right display lit up with the defense grid cascade notification, every orbital ring, every weapons platform, every deep space interceptor battery across the system, acknowledging the arrival and flagging the broadcast source as a potential heritage protocol event. Not a threat event. A heritage protocol event. The taxonomy the Planetary Council had written 800 years ago, when they decided that the possibility of the rig builders returning was real enough to plan for. I sat very still for several seconds. Then I picked up my comm and called my supervisor, Deputy Director Voss, who was 2 floors above me in the Basin Station 12 administrative block. He answered on the second tone, which meant he'd already seen the cascade. His voice had the particular flatness of a man whose professional life has just handed him something he prepared for and never expected to use. I said, Deputy Director, Heritage Protocol on the monitoring arrays, 38 vessels, outer system. He said, I see it. Grid command is already active. Stay on your board. I stayed on my board. The next hour was the quietest hour of my professional life, which I say with full awareness that I have spent 41 years doing a job most people describe as quiet. This was different. This was the quiet of something large happening slowly enough that your instruments are ahead of your comprehension. So you sit and watch the instruments and try to let the comprehension catch up. The monitoring arrays continued logging. The resonance baseline at the Tessivar sites was, as always, stable. The arrival signal from the outer system was registering on the Heritage Protocol channel, not on the rig monitoring channel, and the two are physically separate. The rig components in the ground did not react to the arrival of the ships broadcasting their frequency architecture. Why would they? The rigs were sealed and inert. The signal was in the grid, not in the ground. The components in the ground just kept doing what they had been doing for 70,000 years, resonating at their base frequencies, faint and stable, indifferent to what was happening above them. I found that detail steadying, for reasons I can't entirely explain. The rig components didn't know, they just resonated. On the grid side, the cascade was still resolving. The Heritage Protocol flag had triggered the Contact Engagement Taxonomy, and the Contact Engagement Taxonomy was, in turn, running its automated verification sequence, confirming the signal origin, resolving the ship count, logging the transmission content, routing the full incoming data packet to grid command for manual review. All of that is automated, designed to run without requiring a duty coordinator to make decisions under time pressure. The system does the initial work. The humans receive the package when it's organized. I was receiving mine in real time, which meant I was watching the system work rather than receiving the finished package. I watched the ship count resolve from 38 approximate contact sources to 38 confirmed, each one individually tracked by the outer system sensor array, each one bearing the same resonance-encoded transmission signature. I watched the transmission content log fill in block by block as the depot arrival protocol continued to transmit. The standard approach sequence, methodical and unhurried, the way a cargo operation pings a loading dock during the last leg of a delivery run. I watched the grid node at Basin Station 12 go from passive relay to active integration as the contact engagement protocol brought every node online in coordinated sequence. The defense grid has 44 orbital rings. I have been working adjacent to a relay node on that grid for 41 years. I know intellectually that the grid is large, that its sensor coverage extends to the outer system, that its weapons platforms are distributed across the orbital architecture at intervals designed to ensure coverage overlap, that the warships running station in the mid-system patrol lanes are there because mid-system patrol is a specific operational requirement, not a convenience posting. I know the numbers. I log the node status reports. I attend the annual infrastructure briefings that Basin Station 12 receives as a co-located facility. I had never seen the full grid go to active status simultaneously before. It was not dramatic from where I sat. There was no sound, no visible change in the room around me, nothing that would have told an observer watching me from across the room that anything unusual was happening. The board displays updated. The status indicators shifted from their standard colors to the contact engagement palette. The node integration counter on my right display climbed, in the orderly way that automated systems climb counters from partial to full, and then held. But I knew what each of those status indicators represented. I had read the briefings. I knew what coordinated response posture, full network integration, meant in terms of orbital rings and weapons platforms and warship positions. And sitting there watching it resolve in the dry season morning light in Basin Station 12, I felt the size of it in a way that the briefing documents never quite conveyed. 44 orbital rings going active in sequence. 312 weapons platforms confirming availability. 1,100 warships holding position and awaiting grid command directive. All of it running on a frequency architecture that started in the bedrock 12 meters below my feet. What followed over the next 4 hours was something I have spent 3 weeks trying to find adequate language for, and I don't think I've succeeded. I'll describe what I observed on my displays and what grid command's later briefings told me happened above our sky, and I'll let the facts speak with whatever weight they carry. The Vethani Reclamation Syndicate's lead vessel, the depot caller, in their operational taxonomy, the ship designated to contact the automated systems at the harvest site and coordinate the extraction operation, began transmitting an expanded protocol suite approximately 90 minutes after their initial approach signal. This was their standard arrival sequence. Depot codes first, to wake the systems. Then the full extraction manifest, what they'd planted, where cycle duration, expected yield, collection procedure. The full manifest ran to several hundred data blocks, each one keyed to a specific rig site or component cluster in the Tesavar Basin, and 7 other major deposit zones distributed across the planet's surface. The Vethani had seeded 18 primary sites in total. The Tesavar Basin was the largest, but not the only one. 18 sites across 5 continents, each one precisely located, each one given a site designation and a naming system our translation team spent the better part of 2 days working through. The site designation for the Tesavar cluster translated in working terms as something like Primary Yield Zone 1, which was, I thought when I read the translation, a very exact description of what the basin had been to them. Not a landscape, not a place, a yield zone. Our grid received their full extraction manifest, and because the root protocol architecture matched, began cross-referencing it against its own records. What our grid sent back was not a collection readiness confirmation. It sent back an infrastructure status report. The Vethani Reclamation Syndicate's extraction manifest listed 18 depot sites and a projected harvest yield that their planning documents had calculated as sufficient to supply their industrial operations for approximately 400 years. That yield projection had been set 70,000 years ago, based on the mineral concentration modeling they'd done before planting the rigs. They knew what they'd planted, they knew how the concentration process worked, and they had very precise expectations about what they would find when they came back. A planet of concentrated mineral deposits in 18 recoverable surface zones, automated depot systems still running on the seeded frequency protocols, ready to begin the pre-collection sequence on their arrival signal. No complications. They came to collect an order they'd placed 70,000 years ago and left to fill itself. Our grid reported that the 18 sites had been decommissioned between 11,000 and 6,000 years ago, that the extracted components had been cataloged in the planetary archive under heritage classification, that the concentrated mineral deposits the syndicate's rigs had cultivated over 40,000 years of active operation had been fully mined out by human industrial operations between 9,000 and 4,000 years ago, consumed by the megastructure construction programs, the orbital ring projects, the defense platform manufacturing operations that had defined humanity's rapid industrial expansion across that period, that the alloy science derived from component analysis had seeded 3 successive generations of megastructure construction programs, that the resonance diffusion principle had been adapted into the power distribution architecture of the planetary defense grid 6,000 years ago, that the root-level encoding protocol the syndicate was currently using to communicate with our grid was the direct descendant, through 6,000 years of human engineering, of the frequency architecture their own engineers had designed into the Tesavar rig systems 70 millennia before, that the planetary defense grid, as of the date of their arrival, comprised 1,100 active warships, 44 orbital defense rings, 312 weapons platforms distributed across the system, 6 strategic reserve megastructures in continuous commission, and a population of 28 billion humans living under that defended sky. Our grid sent them all of this in their own data format, using their own protocol language, keyed to their own manifest codes. They had transmitted a collection order in a deep arrival format. We responded with a full status report in the same format, field by field, matching their data architecture exactly. Their yield projections for 18 sites returned as depletion confirmations with usage classifications. Their expected depot system status returned as decommissioning records with heritage classification dates. Their arrival codes reflected back through the architecture of a planetary defense grid that had grown over 60,000 years of human development. So far beyond the system, those codes were designed to address that the gap was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of category. I learned most of this from the briefings that came down through the chain over the following days. In the moment, sitting at my board in Basin Station 12 on a dry season Tuesday morning, what I saw was the alert cascade evolve, one flag dropping and a new one replacing it, the system walking through its own taxonomy in the orderly sequence that 800 years of careful protocol design had specified. The Heritage Protocol flag dropped and was replaced by a Contact Engagement Protocol flag. That meant Grid Command had taken active control. The Planetary Defense Network, all of it, from the Deep Space Interceptor batteries at the system's edge to the orbital rings directly above our sky to the warships already running station in the mid-system patrol lanes, went to coordinated response posture. Not combat posture, coordinated response. There is a difference, and the distinction is one our planetary defense doctrine has refined over 3,000 years of wargaming against every scenario the strategic staff could imagine. Combat posture is what you adopt when you intend to shoot. Coordinated response is what you adopt when you want the other side to understand, without any ambiguity at all, what shooting would cost them. It is the posture of overwhelming, prepared readiness, every capability visible, every platform accounted for, intent controlled and communicated through the simple mathematics of what the other side can see. The message, in this case, was delivered by the Infrastructure Status Report. Numbers are a language every civilization that builds ships understands. You don't need a translator to explain the difference between 38 vessels and 1,100. You don't need to explain the difference between an extraction fleet and 44 orbital defense rings. The arithmetic of the situation was clear in the first few data blocks, and it did not improve for the syndicate as the status report continued. I watched the Vithani syndicate go quiet on my board. Not dark, their signals didn't stop, but quiet. The extraction manifest transmission ceased. The depot contact protocol pings stopped. The arrival sequence, which had been running through its standard steps with the rhythmic procedural regularity of a well-rehearsed logistics operation, stopped in mid-sequence and did not resume. For a stretch of 2 hours and 43 minutes, by my board clock, the 38 Vithani ships held their approach position in the outer system and did not transmit anything our monitoring arrays could decode. Internal communications, presumably, on frequencies we weren't reading. The conversations they were having with each other during those 2 hours and 43 minutes are not something I have access to. I can only observe the silence and understand something of what it contained. They had come to collect 400 years' worth of industrial minerals from 18 preceded sites on a world they had cataloged as an unoccupied geological asset. They had found a planet with 28 billion people and a defense grid that spoke their own root protocol at the base layer. The status report they'd been sent used their own data format to inform them, field by field, that everything they'd planted had been found, studied, mined, and turned into something that now occupied the system they were trying to operate in. The very codes they were using to communicate were our security architecture. 2 hours and 43 minutes of silence. I drank my tea. It had gone cold sometime in the first hour. I drank it anyway because I had been sitting at my board since 10:04 and it was now past 14:00, and some part of my brain that had been watching alert flags for 41 years needed something ordinary to do with my hands. At 14:47, the Vithani Reclamation Syndicate's depot caller transmitted a single data block on the Heritage Protocol frequency. Grid Command relayed it to all active monitoring stations within the hour, which is how it reached my board before the end of my shift. The block was a formal registry notation in the syndicate's operational taxonomy. Our translation teams worked through it carefully over the following 2 days, but the operational meaning was clear from the data structure within minutes of receipt, because formal registry notations in extraction depot systems have a limited vocabulary and a very legible architecture regardless of the specific language encoding. The Vithani Reclamation Syndicate was closing their account. In their operational taxonomy, that phrase has a specific meaning. It means the recorded asset, the depot, the seeded site, the pre-invested resource claim is being struck from the active recovery ledger and reclassified as a non-recoverable loss. A write-off, in the bluntest financial translation. The accounting entry that says we spent the investment and we will not receive a return. The notation includes a standard cause of loss code. Their cause of loss code, when our translation teams worked through the full block, rendered in our language, after considerable discussion about the most accurate phrasing, because the Vethani taxonomy had no word that mapped cleanly onto the concept they were trying to encode as asset developed beyond recovery parameters. Asset developed beyond recovery parameters. I have thought about that phrase every day for 3 weeks. I will probably think about it for the rest of my life. It is a bureaucratic phrase from a civilization that views planets as inventory items, that plants extraction rigs the way an agricultural operation plants a seed crop and expects to harvest it when the season completes. In that language, from that worldview, what they encountered at Earth was a loss event. A specific category of loss, distinguished from simple destruction or theft because the asset still exists. It is not gone, it has not been consumed, it has not been damaged, it has developed. It has become something beyond what the accounting system was designed to track or recover. The phrase is not angry. It is not regretful. It is not anything in the way that an accounting notation is not anything except precise. They came to collect an asset. The asset had developed beyond recovery parameters. They closed the account and left. I understand why they coded it that way. I don't resent it. In fact, I find it almost touching, in the way that a genuinely alien perspective sometimes is touching because it reveals the size of the gap between what they expected and what they found, and because the gap is too large for their taxonomy to bridge. They are not wrong, exactly. From their frame of reference, asset developed beyond recovery parameters is the most accurate description available of what happened to their investment. It is not sufficient, but it is what they had to work with, and there is something honest about using the closest available term when the closest available term is still very far away. 70,000 years. I keep coming back to that number because it is the number this whole story turns on, and I want to be careful about what it means from where I sit. The Vethani Reclamation Syndicate seeded 18 depot sites on this planet 70,000 years ago. Our species, as best our archaeologists can establish, was already present on Earth at that time, not as a civilization, not with cities or infrastructure or anything the Syndicate's survey teams would have registered as significant, but present. Walking, thinking, making tools, burying our dead, crossing from one continent to another in groups we cannot now name. A species at the beginning of its long development, too small to notice, too diffuse to catalog, irrelevant by any metric an industrial extraction operation would apply to a survey world. They saw a good mineral world and they worked it. We were not part of the equation. 70,000 years later, they came back and found us not part of their equation in an entirely different direction. I've tried to calculate what that span actually means in human terms, in the quiet hours of the weeks since the Vethani departure. 70,000 years is longer than most of our civilizations have names for. It contains the entirety of what we call human history, and still has room left over for more time before that history started than the history contains. Every empire and every republic, every language alive and every language dead, every technological revolution and every dark age, every generation of parents raising children to inherit something better, and every generation of children deciding what better meant and building toward it. All of it fits inside the back 40,000 years of the Tessivar rig's operational cycle, the period after they started running, but before we found them. They were running while all of that happened. Quietly, far below the surface, doing their slow mechanical work, drawing mineral substrates up from the mantle, concentrating them in the upper crust, unaware that the world above them was changing in ways no geological instrument would register. The rigs measured rock. They didn't measure us. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story that is simply triumphant, and I don't think that version is honest. The Vethani Reclamation Syndicate didn't do anything to us. They planted rigs in our bedrock 70,000 years ago, and they planned to come back and collect what they'd cultivated. They did not enslave us. They did not invade us. They did not even know we were there, not in any meaningful sense. Their survey records presumably noted biological activity on the surface, the way any planetary survey notes the presence or absence of fauna. But biological activity is not civilization, and the syndicate was not in the business of tracking the development of fauna. They were in the business of extracting minerals from planetary crusts. There are people I know who have spent the 3 weeks since the Vethani departure building the case for grievance, that they seeded our world without our consent, which is true. That they intended to return and extract what they'd cultivated from a planet they considered property without any regard for whatever might have grown here in the meantime, which is also true, and which is the thing that causes the most friction when I try to think about it cleanly. We were not, in their accounting, a relevant variable. We were the world's surface conditions. Background. I understand why that causes anger. I hold the anger and I examine it, and I try to be honest about how much of it is justified, and how much of it is the natural reaction of any people told that they were not being thought about during 70,000 years of history. The answer I come back to is that the accounting is complicated, and anyone who simplifies it in either direction is leaving something out. What I'm sure of is that we are here, and we built what we built, and the civilization standing above the tests of our basin now does not require their acknowledgement to be real. The Vethani were not our adversaries. They were, in the most precise sense, our unknowing benefactors, not because they intended to benefit us, but because the questions their rigs raised were real questions, and real questions change the civilizations that hold them. That is not comfortable, it is true. Now, I want to tell you about the rig sites, because I said at the beginning that they never made sense to me as a child, and that 41 years at Basin Station 12 changed that, and I have been working up to the part where I explain what changed. The tests of our sites, the ones I monitor, the ones now heritage protected under Planetary Council mandate, the ones whose resonance signatures I log every Tuesday morning from my board, are 12 in number within the basin proper, with another 4 extending into the plateau margin to the north. 16 of the 18 original Syndicate depot sites in this region. The other 2 are in the old coastal sector, now occupied by the port megastructure. Their resonance signatures logged by the Port Authority's Infrastructure Monitoring Division, which has been a parallel track to Basin Station 12's record for the past 3,000 years. What the Vethani planted here, 70,000 years ago, was not crude. I want to be clear about that because I think we sometimes talk about alien technology in a way that flatters our own reverse engineering more than it respects the original engineering. What they planted was elegant. The resonance diffusion system, the way it drew mineral-rich substrates up from the deep mantle and concentrated them in recoverable bands in the upper crust, was something our materials scientists studied for 3,000 years before they understood it well enough to replicate the basic principle. 3,000 years. The engineers who finally cracked the diffusion architecture were working from the accumulated documentation of dozens of previous generations, all of them chipping away at the same problem, each one getting slightly closer. And what they produced when they cracked it wasn't a copy. It was a human version. Something that took the underlying principle and bent it toward human engineering problems, power distribution, structural resonance, lattice matrix architecture. Something that solved our questions using their logic and came out looking entirely like our own invention, because in the ways that mattered, it was. The human hand was in every derivation, every adaptation, every design choice that took the Vethani resonance principle and decided it would work better if we applied it this way instead of that way. For this problem, instead of the one it was originally designed to solve. I think about that process a lot, standing at the rig sites on my quarterly surface inspections. The physical structures are sealed now, the excavation shafts capped and marked with Heritage Survey stakes, the site perimeters maintained by the Basin Heritage Authority. The basin floor around the sites looks, on a dry, clear morning, like any other part of the southern megaplex's managed landscape. Survey stakes and monitoring equipment half hidden in the low ground cover. The megaplex towers visible on the southern horizon, the plateau edge catching the early light to the north. But the resonance signatures still come up through the ground. Not from active machinery, the rigs have not run for thousands of years, but from the alloy components still sealed in situ, deep in the bedrock below the capped shafts, their material structure still resonating at the base frequencies the syndicate's engineers tuned them to 70,000 years ago. That material property doesn't decay. It was built to last indefinitely, and it has. When I run my hand scanner over the survey stakes, I still get readings. Faint, stable, exactly on baseline within measurement tolerance every Tuesday morning for 41 years. The readings feel like something to me after 41 years. I know that's not science. A monitoring coordinator is not supposed to have feelings about resonance baseline readings, but I do, and I've decided I'm old enough to admit it. The readings feel like patience. They feel like the specific quality of something that has been waiting in the ground for a very long time, not because it lacks the means to stop waiting, but because waiting is what it was built to do. Whoever designed these rigs expected them to last. They built them to outlast everything, because they needed them to still be functional after however many tens of thousands of years the mineral concentration cycle required. They didn't know a species would find them in the meantime and spend 11,000 years taking them apart and asking questions about what they meant. But they built for permanence, and permanence has a character. And after 41 years of logging it on Tuesday mornings, I can tell you that its character is patient. They built to last. We found what they built. We lasted. On the day of the Vethani departure, day 3 of the contact event, by the count the grid command used in their briefings, I was still at my board in Basin Station 12 when the departure burn registered on our outer system sensors. 38 ships, in a coordinated burn sequence that our system logged as a standard fleet transit departure, accelerating away from our system on a vector that the planetary defense network tracked from the moment the burn initiated. The defense network kept them in its targeting catalog, all 38 ships, individually resolved, velocities and headings updated in real time, for the full duration of the transit window, until the ships crossed the outer sensor boundary and disappeared from our active tracking. Not because we were going to shoot. We weren't. They had struck our account from their ledger as a non-recoverable loss, and we had no interest in converting a ledger closure into a shooting war over minerals that had been ours for 9,000 years. We tracked them because that is what you do with 38 ships departing your system when you do not know with certainty whether they intend to come back. You watch until you can no longer watch, and then you keep the records, because the records are how you remain ready. Grid Command's final notation on the contact event was brief. I read it in the duty log the morning after the ships cleared the outer boundary. The Heritage Protocol flag was retired. The contact engagement flag was retired. The defense network returned to standard coordinated patrol posture. The monitoring arrays at Basin Station 12 and all parallel sites returned to regular logging cycle. The Grid Command duty officer filed a 4-line closure report, noted the successful execution of Heritage Protocol contact procedures, and went home. 4 lines for a 70,000-year event. I understand it. That's how records work. The record captures what happened, not what it meant. What it meant is something each person who reads the record carries individually for as long as they carry it. The record is just the facts. What happened when the outcome, the current status? The current status of the Heritage Protocol flag is retired, no further action required. I sat at my board for a while after the flags came down. It was evening by then. The dry season sky outside the Basin Station windows was going to the particular deep amber it gets when the sun is low, and the atmospheric scrubbers have been running clean all day. The megaplex towers on the southern horizon were beginning to show their running lights, that orderly cascade of green and white from the lowest platforms to the highest. The rhythm of it so familiar after 41 years that I see it even when I'm not looking. The defense grid relay antenna on the roof above me was cycling through its standard evening calibration sequence. The low harmonic it produces during calibration, barely audible through the building structure, felt more than heard. I thought about the Vethani engineers who designed the Tessavar rigs, not the syndicate that sent the 38 ships. They are accountants in the end, operators who manage a ledger and come to collect when the numbers say to come. I thought about the engineers, the actual builders. Whoever spent the working hours, 70,000 years ago, fabricating the conduit assemblies and the resonance chambers and the concentration matrices, making sure the alloy bonding was exact and the frequency calibration was precise, and the systems were sealed correctly before they went into the shaft. The people who knew what they were building and did the work carefully, because careful work was what the job required. They didn't know about us. They were doing a job, building a thing that needed to be built well, on a world that their survey had assessed as available, and they did it with the care that an engineer applies to work that is expected to last. I think about them because I think they would understand, in a way that the syndicate's accountants perhaps don't, what happened to what they built. Their work lasted. Their engineering held for 70,000 years in the sealed dark, doing its job, and when someone finally found it and took it apart to understand it, the questions it raised were so fundamental and so precise that they changed everything. Not by accident, not by some miraculous translation of one culture's technology into another's. By the ordinary, hard, cumulative process of people taking a real question seriously and passing it down, generation to generation, until someone finally answered it and the answer opened a door. The engineers would understand that, I think. The syndicate's accountants can only see the loss. The engineers made something that lasted and was found and was used. That is not a loss. That is a different kind of yield than the one that was planned for, but it is a yield. I am going to retire in the spring. I have been planning to for 2 years, and the contact event has not changed my plans, though it has confirmed something I wanted to have confirmed before I left. I wanted to understand, before I walked away from this post, what the Tessavar sites actually were. Not in the archaeological sense. I understood that long ago. In the sense that matters when you have spent 41 years watching something and you want to know, at the end, that you understood what you were watching. I understand now. The Tessavar sites are the first chapter of a story that does not end with the Vethani syndicate closing their account. Their account is closed. The story is not. We know now, with certainty, that the galaxy contains at least one other civilization that views planetary crusts as harvestable assets, that plants long-cycle extraction infrastructure across timescales that dwarf human recorded history, and that maintains careful records of its investments against the day of collection. We know that the Tessavar sites were not unique, that the Vethani seeded planets across a range sufficient to justify the kind of industrial logistics operation that involves 38 ships and a dedicated depot caller. We know that they had been managing planetary mineral assets for long enough, and at sufficient scale, to develop a taxonomy for a loss event as specific as asset developed beyond recovery parameters. We know they had never needed that specific taxonomy before we gave them reason to write it. That last point is the one that keeps me up at night when I let it. Not with fear, with something more like the awareness of standing at the edge of a very large question. If the Vethani Reclamation Syndicate has seeded depot worlds across a wide enough range to maintain a 38-ship collection fleet, and if their operational model has never previously required the taxonomy entry we just forced them to create, then what that means, in the plainest terms, is that we are the first planet they seeded that became something they couldn't collect. In all their history of this practice, however long that history is, however many worlds it spans, we are the entry that broke the accounting. That is not something to be proud of in the simple way. It is something to understand clearly. The scholars will spend the next several thousand years working through the implications. The defense strategists are already working through a different set of implications, the ones that involve the question of how many other civilizations operating at the Vethani Syndicate's apparent scale might have made similar investments in the deep past of various other worlds in this region of space. The Planetary Council has already convened the first meetings of what the public briefing described as an extended heritage assessment, which is the kind of carefully unmemorable name that governments give to something they consider important and want to avoid alarming anyone about prematurely. I will leave that work to younger people with more energy and fewer Tuesday mornings behind them. It is the right work. It should be done. What I will take with me when I leave Basin Station 12 in the spring is simpler. I spent 41 years watching the residual signature of something 70,000 years old. The readings came up faint and stable every Tuesday morning, unchanged in any measurement from the week before, the month before, the decade before. They will come up the same way next Tuesday and the Tuesday after, and for as many Tuesdays as anyone sits at this board and logs them. The rigs are done. The components that remain sealed in the ground will resonate at their base frequency until the geology itself changes, which is a longer timescale than any of us work on. But the civilization those rigs helped build, the questions they raised, and the answers those questions produced over 11,000 years of human engineering, that's not done. That's overhead. That's the 44 orbital rings and the 1,200 warships and the 28 billion people, and the defense grid that speaks the Vethani's own protocol language at its base layer. Because a chain of human engineers, generation by generation, took a question seriously until they answered it and then kept going. We didn't wait for them to come back. We didn't know they were coming. We built because building is what we do, and the building happened to make us ready, and when they came we were standing in what we'd made, and what we'd made was sufficient. I don't know if I would call that triumph. It's too large and too quiet for the word. It is more like the feeling of a thing completed, not finished, because nothing here is finished but completed in the sense of a circle closed. They planted. We found. We built. They came back. We were here. The account is closed. The story continues. I'll log the resonance signatures again on Tuesday, same as always. The readings will come up faint and stable, exactly on baseline, the long echo of engineering that has outlasted everyone who made it. I'll record the values, note any variance from the previous week's baseline, file the report, and make another cup of tea. The Heritage Protocol flag has been retired. The Contact Engagement flag has been retired. The defense network is at standard patrol posture. The grid is healthy, all nodes nominal, all platforms in commission. Somewhere out beyond the outer sensor boundary, 38 Vethani ships are moving away from our system on a vector our tracking system no longer has data on. They know what they found. They close the account. If they tell the rest of their kind what they found, others will come eventually, out of curiosity if nothing else. And if others come, the Heritage Protocol flag will fire again, on the same root frequency, and the same cascade will run, and the same status report will go out, updated for whatever year that is, with whatever numbers apply. We don't need the flag to be ready. We have been ready for 800 years, and before that we were building without knowing readiness was the destination, And before that we were asking questions that started in the tests of our bedrock. We know how to wait. We have always known how to wait. It is the first thing you learn, 41 years at a monitoring post in the tests of our basin, sitting with the long quiet of something ancient in the ground below you and the living hum of everything that grew from it in the sky above. We remember, that's the whole of it. We remember, and we build, and we wait. And when something finally comes back to collect what it planted in our ground, it finds that the planting was the least of what grew here.